Imagine tasting something sweet, but your brain reacting completely differently depending on where that sweetness came from. Because not all sweetness feels the same. Some sweeteners feel clean, some feel heavy, some disappear quickly, others stay on your tongue long after you swallow. And once you understand the difference between sweeteners, you stop thinking of sweetness as just sugar. Because sweetness is not one thing. It's chemistry, texture, perception, even psychology. Some sweeteners come directly from plants. Some are heavily refined. Some contain calories. Some contain almost none. And some are designed entirely in laboratories. But here's what most people don't realize. Sweeteners don't just change flavor. They change how food behaves, how drinks feel, how desserts bake, how your brain experiences sweetness itself. And this is where everything starts: white sugar. This is the standard most people compare everything else to. Refined sugar, clean, simple, neutral, usually made from sugar cane or sugar beets, then processed until almost everything except sucrose is removed. And this is why white sugar tastes so straightforward. There are no strong extra flavors, no bitterness, no complexity, just sweetness. And this simplicity is exactly why it became dominant worldwide. Because white sugar doesn't interfere. It blends into almost anything: coffee, desserts, sauces, drinks, baking. But this is where most people underestimate it. Sugar does more than sweeten food. It changes texture. In baking, sugar affects softness, moisture, browning, structure. Remove sugar from a dessert, and the entire product changes. Not just the taste, the texture too. And this is where sweeteners become more complicated than people expect. Now let's move into something much older: honey. Humans were consuming honey long before refined sugar existed. And unlike white sugar, honey carries identity. You can taste where it came from: floral, earthy, light, dark. Different flowers create different flavors, and this is what makes honey unique. It's not just sweetness, it's character. Some honey feels bright and delicate, others feel deep and rich. And because honey contains water, it behaves differently in cooking. It adds moisture, density, stickiness, which is why baked goods made with honey often feel softer and heavier than those made with plain sugar. But this is where things get interesting. Honey is sweeter than white sugar by volume, which means you often need less of it, and yet its flavor feels more complex. Now compare that to maple syrup. Real maple syrup comes from the sap of maple trees, and producing it takes enormous effort. Because the sap itself is mostly water, it has to be boiled down repeatedly until the sugars concentrate. And this is why real maple syrup feels different from artificial syrup. Real maple syrup has layers, caramel notes, woodiness, depth. Artificial pancake syrups often imitate sweetness, but not complexity. And this is where most people don't realize something important. Sweetness alone doesn't create satisfaction. Flavor depth matters too. This is why some sweeteners feel empty, while others feel rich and complete. Now let's move into something entirely different: stevia. Stevia comes from a plant, but unlike sugar or honey, it contains almost no calories. And this is where modern sweeteners changed completely. Because now, the goal was no longer just sweetness. The goal became sweetness without energy. And stevia is incredibly powerful. Tiny amounts create intense sweetness, much sweeter than regular sugar. But here's the trade-off. Many people notice a slightly bitter or cooling aftertaste. And this is where sweeteners become psychological, because your brain compares sweetness to expectation. When something tastes sweet, your brain expects the full experience of sugar, but alternative sweeteners sometimes interrupt that expectation. And the result feels different, not necessarily worse, just different. Now this is where things become even more engineered. Artificial sweeteners, aspartame, sucralose, saccharin. These are designed specifically to create sweetness, with little or no calories, and some are hundreds of times sweeter than sugar itself, which means tiny amounts can sweeten entire products. Diet sodas, sugar-free snacks, protein products, chewing gum. Artificial sweeteners are everywhere. And this is where opinions become divided, because some people prefer the reduced calories, others dislike the aftertaste. And this is where most people don't realize something fascinating. Sweetness is not just detected by the tongue, it's interpreted by the brain. Texture matters, temperature matters, aftertaste matters, expectation matters, And this is why two equally sweet products can feel completely different. Now let's move into brown sugar. At first glance, it just looks like darker sugar, but the difference is molasses. Brown sugar contains molasses, which creates a deeper flavor and softer texture. This is why cookies made with brown sugar often feel chewier, richer, more moist. And this is where sweeteners stop being just flavor ingredients. They start becoming texture tools. Now let's move into agave syrup. This sweetener comes from the agave plant. It became popular partly because it blends smoothly into drinks and recipes. But here's what makes it interesting. Agave is high in fructose, which changes how sweetness is perceived. It feels smooth, mild, less sharp than plain sugar. And this is why some people prefer it in beverages. Now let's talk about coconut sugar. Unlike white sugar, coconut sugar is less refined. It keeps more of its natural color and flavor, which creates subtle caramel notes, almost toasted. And this is where many natural sweeteners separate themselves. They don't just sweeten, they contribute flavor. Now here's something most people never think about. Sweeteners change timing. Some sweetness hits instantly, some build slowly, some disappears quickly, others linger. And this changes how food feels psychologically. Fast sweetness feels sharp and immediate. Lingering sweetness feels heavier and richer. This is why different sweeteners create different emotional experiences. Now let's step back for a second, because this is where the bigger picture appears. Humans are biologically wired to seek sweetness. For most of human history, sweet foods were rare. Fruit, honey, natural sugars. And because calorie-dense foods were valuable for survival, your brain evolved to reward sweetness heavily, which is why sweet foods feel satisfying so quickly. Your brain treats sweetness like a reward signal, and this is where modern food changed everything. Because once refined sugar became cheap and abundant, sweetness stopped being rare. Now it exists everywhere: drinks, sauces, bread, snacks. And this changed how people experience food entirely. Now here's where things become more complicated. Not all sweeteners behave the same under heat. Sugar caramelizes. Honey browns faster. Artificial sweeteners sometimes lose stability. And this is why replacing one sweetener with another doesn't always work. Because sweetness is only part of the equation. Behavior matters too. This is where many people fail when cooking or baking. They replace sugar, expecting identical results. But the structure changes, the moisture changes, the texture changes, and suddenly, the final product feels completely different. Now think about this psychologically. Your brain can detect tiny differences in sweetness, not just intensity, but quality. Natural sweetness often feels softer, rounder. Artificial sweetness can feel sharper, more concentrated. And this is why people often describe sweeteners emotionally, even when they don't realize it. Clean, heavy, artificial, smooth, because sweetness is deeply tied to perception. Now here's something fascinating. Some sweeteners are so powerful, they're used in microscopic amounts. Others require large quantities to create the same effect. And this directly affects food structure. A drink sweetened with sugar feels different from one sweetened artificially, even at identical sweetness levels, because sugar adds body, density, mouthfeel. And this is why removing sugar entirely from products often changes more than taste. Now step back one final time, because this is the most important part. Sweeteners are not just ingredients, they are systems of flavor, chemistry, and perception working together. Some create brightness, some create richness, some create texture, some create intensity without substance. And once you understand that, you stop asking, what's the sweetest? And start asking, what experience does this create? Because in the end, sweetness is not just about taste. It's about how your brain experiences reward. And every sweetener changes that experience in a completely different way.